So welcome. I hope everyone's having an amazing Sunday. We're about to get this party started with, of course, a topic that you probably rushed through super quick if you were lucky enough to get to it. We're talking Unit 9, 1980 to the current. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking a look at analyzing the rise of the conservative movement. We're going to hopefully help you out with some documents to understand how to craft a thesis statement, which is 1 point in both the DBQ and LEQ, and use evidence to support your argument. And if you're looking at kind of the historical thinking skills that we're rocking today, it is causation for you. And hopefully this will help you out. So, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, my name is Daniel Jocz, and I just like to share, and over the next 10 episodes, I'll be sharing a fun fact about myself each episode, because, you know, you all want to get to know me, right? I would love to get to know you, so put some stuff in the chat. But in 2016, I was California Teacher of the Year, and I got invited to the White House. Hey, I got this torn invitation. It was all fancy, but you know what I did when I was at the White House after I got done taking my fancy photo, had my eyebrows on fleek? What I spent time doing is stealing the toilet paper and napkins, because if you don't know, in both the White House and the Vice President's mansion, they got personalized, or not personalized, but they got the official seal on it. And I want to be living that presidential life. So got myself a whole bag of these things. I don't know what I'm ever going to do with them, but at parties, I could just go, hey, want a White House napkin? Too bad. You can't have it because it's special to me, as my kids say. Anyways, y'all, first up, what I'm going to do, and this is kind of how we're going to run these sessions over the next 10 episodes, I'm going to have a topic. I'm going to break it down very quickly. If you're trying to take notes, don't worry. At the end, I got the Google Slides for you. I got some Google Docs for you. And after I'm done giving you a very quick overview that kind of simplifies things or oversimplifies things, but hopefully reminds you of a few things you've learned, then we're going to dig into like what this may look like on the actual exam. So I do this with my own students, and you know, they do pretty well. And I'll talk about that tomorrow at our next session, episode 2. So this one's all about the rise of the conservative movement. And the thing you need to understand first and foremost is the context of this. You know, contextualization is a very important part of this particular exam. And the contextualization, let me plug my computer in, it's having some problems, is, remember, there was a rise of liberalism. It came to dominate post-war politics and court decisions. And we're talking post-World War II, the presidencies of Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower, all of them, even though Eisenhower was a moderate Republican, so he really doesn't really factor into the rise of liberalism, but he's not going to turn back the clock to the way things were before Truman or Roosevelt. And remember, what happens is the context of this particular period of the 60s and the 50s is the image of prosperity of the 1950s was called into question. You have the book, The Other America by Michael Harrington, where he's talking about poverty in America, and other folks are shining a spotlight on the fact that you have a continued lack of civil rights. It remained a problem in America. And even under Franklin Roosevelt, things weren't really done with regard to civil rights. Remember, he consciously chose not to tackle that issue because he didn't want to kind of alienate Southern Democrats. Truman does desegregate the military, and that gets his party to split from him with the Dixiecrat Party. And what we see is really under Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, the growth of the post-war liberalism. So Eisenhower is a Republican, he's a moderate, but all the other people you see on that screen are Democrats, some being much more ambitious with their domestic programs. And so what we see really is under Lyndon Johnson, and hopefully you kind of had some time in class to get into his presidency, but basically there's a whole bunch of legislation that is passed that kind of becomes under the umbrella of the Great Society. And what this did is it dramatically increased the scope and size of the federal government. That's this idea of liberalism. We saw this during the Great Depression with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. But remember, unlike the the New Deal, which was focused on solving the problems of the Great Depression, providing relief, recovery, reform, the Great Society is not responding to an economic collapse that is occurring across the country. It's responding to the continuation of poverty, the continuation of the denial of civil rights. And so you see all sorts of programs. And I'll just kind of highlight a few that you may want to know about. Medicare, healthcare for those over 65, Medicaid, healthcare for the poor and disabled. And once again, in the chat, feel free to say, hey, I'm completely lost, or can you expand on that? And I'm happy to do it. So you got some programs like that. You have a very significant law. And if you haven't learned much about this law, just know that the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 ended the quotas that were designed to restrict certain nationalities. Remember those quotas in the 1920s, the quotas that talked about trying to limit Southern Eastern European immigrants. Also, the Immigration and Nationality Act gets rid of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so what this means is new groups of people are coming to the United States, people from Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and places that were not as represented in the demographics of America prior to 1965. And so you see a lot of changes. And of course, a really big one is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those changes, which dealt with the issue of civil rights and voting rights, caused a backlash. Not everyone is happy about these programs, these changes, and the Great Society as a whole. So this is the kind of framework in which you have also the Supreme Court doing things during this time period. And it's really important you know about this court. It is the Warren Court, named after the Chief Justice at the time, Earl Warren. You can see him right there grabbing that book. And under the Supreme Court, these judges, largely appointed by Democratic presidents, so they tended to tilt a little bit more liberal in their understanding of the law, they also greatly expanded individual freedoms and democracy. And so you get some cases, Griswold versus Connecticut. Citizen has a right to privacy, thus birth control cannot be prohibited. That was a very important case in terms of one issue that a lot of people were talking about, especially the feminist movement. You have Miranda versus Arizona in 1966 that basically says, if you are arrested, you have the right to remain silent and speak with an attorney. So always remember that if you are ever arrested, hopefully not, you will be read your Miranda rights. And if you're not, you have a good chance of getting out of whatever they arrested you for. And then the big kind of moment happens a little bit later, not under the Warren Court, with another decision, Roe v. Wade, which continues to kind of be part of the national discourse. Like, people don't agree with the issue of abortion and its constitutionality. And so you have all this stuff going on in the 60s and 70s, and not everyone's a huge fan of it. And you start getting some criticisms early on, even before the Great Society, even before Lyndon Johnson. You know, remember when Franklin Roosevelt was proposing his dramatic increase of the size and scope of the federal government? Not everyone was on board with that, but it was the Great Depression. So most of his policies were able to pass through a Democratic-controlled Congress. And so the debate wasn't as fierce as it will be in the 60s and 70s. And what you see is criticisms from the right. And one of those criticisms is from a guy by the name of Barry Goldwater. And you're going to see a document from him a little bit later. And Barry Goldwater will run for the presidency in 1964. He will lose to Lyndon B. Johnson, but he represents this kind of rising, growing conservative movement. And what they're really rallying around is the critiques of liberalism as they saw it. They don't like the policies of Lyndon Johnson, to some extent Kennedy, and to some extent Franklin Roosevelt. They don't like a large federal government. They criticize the high deficits, the government spending. They were going to later on, not in the early 60s, but later on in the late 60s, early 70s, we're going to really be mobilized around the decisions of the Warren Court. How dare you give rights to criminals? How dare you legalize birth control? This is, in some people's minds, immoral or beyond what the government should be doing. And then, of course, a big one later on, especially in the 70s and 80s, is there's this feeling amongst some conservatives, especially more religious evangelical conservatives, that traditional morality was being undermined. They mobilized against Roe v. Wade, anti-abortion, mobilized against the growing gay pride movement that kind of develops after Stonewall. And so you see all this kind of stuff taking place at this time. And so what you need to understand about all this is eventually kind of Nixon will get elected in 1968. Remember, the Democrats were all a mess. They were fighting. Lyndon Johnson was like, peace, I'm out. I'm not running for re-election. The Democrats are divided between those who want to support the Vietnam War and those who want to say, let's get out of this thing. And Nixon is able to kind of mobilize enough support and become president. He is a Republican. He's a hardcore anti-communist guy, but he's really not the kind of new conservative movement, at least not to the extent that we're going to see in 1980. And the other thing about Nixon is, he's a complicated figure. He's the guy who's going to escalate the war in Vietnam, but also get us out of the war in Vietnam. He's the guy who kind of establishes the EPA, but also has policies that are more conservative. And unfortunately for Nixon, Vietnam and eventually Watergate, the scandal of his involvement in the Democratic break-in, further undermined his administration and eroded trust in government. And basically, you have other things going on that, once again, maybe at this point in the year, you didn't really do them the justice they deserve in your class because you're running out of time. But the women's rights movement had been going on. You have The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, which it's talking about. It's criticizing traditional gender roles. Many conservatives, many evangelical conservatives do not like these new discussions about womanhood and manhood. You have this changing family structure as a number of working women increases. Part of it is the fact that it's hard to survive in America in the later decades on just one income. So it becomes necessary for both the man and the woman to work. You have the Equal Rights Amendment. There was a huge campaign against it by conservative leaders. It falls short of that ratification. And then, of course, like I mentioned, Roe versus Wade really was a pivotal moment in mobilizing some conservative groups because of the issue of abortion. You have the Immigration Act, which is going to allow new immigrant groups to come into the United States, opening up debates that we're still having right now. Who should be able to come into the United States? Should some countries be favored over others? So there's a lot of stuff going on before we even get to the kind of 1980s. The University of California decision versus Bach upheld affirmative action that said race could be one of several factors in admission for universities. And then, of course, Stonewall, which emerges and really kind of is seen as the birth of the LGBTQ movement. So this is the setting. And I know that was a very quick and hopefully somewhat helpful and familiar overview, but really, it ain't new. And one of the things you're going to see over the next 10 episodes is just the complexity of history and how certain historical themes reemerge time and time again. And remember, in the 1920s, as America was becoming more secular, more urban, people were moving to cities, listening to jazz music, you had this backlash against religious fundamentalists or by religious fundamentalists who felt that these changes were turning America down a dangerous road. And remember, they responded to the teaching of evolution in the Scopes trial, and then things continue to move on. But in the 80s, and really in the late 70s and 80s, a new evangelical movement, a new Christian fundamentalist movement will really start to mobilize. And unlike the Scopes trial, where it's kind of singly focused on this issue of evolution, the Butler Act in the state of Tennessee, this one's going to really kind of come out in favor of what are traditional family values, against gay marriage, against abortion. And then other conservatives are going to be more concerned in some cases about the size of government, what government's doing in this type of stuff. So eventually, Reagan easily wins the presidency in 1980. There he is shaking hands with Jimmy Carter, who he is going to easily defeat in the presidential election. Carter is going to have trouble with governing. He's going to have a series of problems, Iran, hostage crisis, the economy's not going to be doing too hot, and Reagan comes in and woos enough support to win the presidency. So that's my way too simplistic, way too fast, quick review of this kind of context for this movement. And my goal today, though, is I'm not here to try to teach you everything you may have forgotten or maybe missed in class. What would you do with this information on test day, sitting down, nervous, palms sweaty, mom spaghetti on your shirt? Like, what are you going to do when you need to score points on these different 4 components of the exam? And so today, since it's our first episode, we're going to focus on the thesis and defending a thesis, because like I said, it's a point in the DBQ, it's a point in the LEQ. Really, when you're writing short essay questions, the SAQ, you're really just kind of writing your argument out. And I want you to feel competent in doing that. And more importantly, I want you to do it the right way so that you don't miss out on easy points. And so just to kind of remind you of what the thesis is supposed to be, it should be a slam dunk for you. And really, it's not. A lot of students struggle with getting the thesis because they make some common mistakes that I'm going to go over and then kind of explain how to avoid them. But basically, when you're looking at a thesis statement, it's all about you respond to the prompt with a historically defensible thesis or claim that establishes a line of reasoning. That is what you're doing. It is your argument. That is the goal. And so, for instance, if I was going to make an argument, what is the greatest cartoon in the world right now? I might say it's Peppa Pig, just because my kids make me watch it and now I'm wearing their merch. And then I would need to come up with what are the reasons why I think Peppa Pig is the best cartoon. And then I would have to defend those reasons. We make thesis statements all the time in our life. Why is Kobe Bryant the best basketball player? Why are the New England Patriots not going to win the Super Bowl this year? We always make these claims. Why is the show Euphoria not appropriate for high school kids to watch? Or why is it appropriate for high school kids to watch? Whatever your position is, but it's the problem when you have to do it in history that throws some students off. So historically defensible and a line of reasoning is the important pieces here. And I want to remind you, they need to have this. And what you must do is you got to answer all parts of the question. The old joke is AP doesn't stand for advanced placement. It stands for answer prompt. And so don't answer the question you want it to be, answer the question it actually is. And I'm going to be completely honest with you. Some of these questions they throw at you all are tricky. Some of them got like layers to it. It's like, whoa, it's not just one question. It's like a question within a question. And it can get a little overwhelming, especially when you're doing it in a timed environment. It must be historically defensible. So you can't just kind of restate the prompt. You got to like have something that you could defend with evidence. And you must have a line of reasoning. And I'm going to show you what all these look like in relation to the conservative movement that we are looking at today. So it can't just restate the prompt. You can't not take a position, and you better have a line of reasoning. If you don't, you won't get the point. And I can't tell you how often I've read essays where they think they have a thesis, but it ain't it. And we want to avoid that. So here's our question for today. And if you look in the description of the YouTube video, whether you're watching it live with us or tuning in a little bit later, you will see that we have some resources that will help you if you want to take this question to the end. You want to write the whole thing. We won't have the time to do that today, but we're going to take a look at this prompt, which is explain the reasons why a new conservatism rose to prominence in the US between 1960 and 1989. And the reason why this particular question can get a little tricky is the first time you read and you're analyzing the prompt, which is the first step, you got to figure out, okay, what is this thing asking me? And the thing that you also need to keep in mind, and we're going to go over it into that, sorry, just a minute here. To Sanaya, we will get into how to get into a historically defensible thesis. I'm going to give you some examples of this bad boy, and we're going to kind of walk through it. So we got you. And if you have some questions after that, let me know. So the first step is to read and analyze the prompt and to really kind of make sense of what it's saying and hopefully figure out, what is the prompt asking you to do? And the good thing about this particular prompt is it's pretty straightforward. It's basically asking you, why did a new conservative movement emerge between the years 1960 and 1989? And I see Denisha says causation. That is 100% correct. Like, what caused it? And we're going to be going into causation a couple times over the next couple of episodes. We have an episode, I believe it's episode 5, talking about the Civil War. What caused it? And that is an issue that also causes controversy today, the cause of the Civil War. But we're going to show you how to deal with controversial issues and how to write that you're thinking historically, but also critically. So what I think is difficult about this question is not kind of what it's asking you to do. That may be difficult because maybe you didn't cover it in class because it's the end of the year and your teacher's scrambling to fit all this material into a limited amount of class time. What makes this question difficult is the time frame. And before I get into that time frame thing, there is what they will ask you to do. And I know it's not very large on your screen, that causation is the historical skill. And if you look on the slides, you will see that causation has a number of things that they expect. And this is where it gets really needlessly, I think, complicated. And so causation describes causes and or effects of a specific historical development or process. So can you describe them, like what caused the conservative movement to emerge? It doesn't necessarily ask you the effects in terms of this question, but when you're dealing with causation, they definitely, when you're describing causes, you will kind of lead into some discussion of effects. The next one is explain the relationship between the causes and effects of a specific historical development or process. So like, what was the relationship between these different things? And then how did it play out in reality? This is really important. It's something that we're going to talk in episode 5 when we get to the Civil War. Explain the difference between primary and secondary causes and between short and long-term effects. So when we're dealing with something, there's usually multiple causes for why things happen. Like even if you're in a relationship and you get dumped or you do the dumping, there's probably more than one reason why your love that was going to last forever falls apart. It's rarely one thing. And so there's not going to be just one reason why the conservative movement rose up. So you may want to talk about this was the main reason. This was also a reason as well. And then you could see the rest of the stuff, the significance. But basically, the short version of this is when you're talking about causation, there's layers to it. There's the kind of like you cover it. Then there's the I really get into it. And that's when you get into the complex understanding and the main reasons why things happened. Here's what I think is hard about this question, and it really challenges students, the time frame. 1960 to 1989 actually goes through 2 different periods in AP US history. And one of the things I've noticed over the last couple of years is I think partly the College Board is worried about cheating. And, East Coast people, where are you at, East Coast people? Show me in the chat. Where are you at? Where are you at? But East Coast people, getting out of the exam and then tweeting through one of their burner accounts, DBQ memes or APUSH exam memes, which you're not supposed to, get in trouble, cancel your scores. And then that giving an advantage to people taking the test later. And there's all sorts of different versions of the test, but so the questions have become more and more complicated, things you can't really Google. And when you look at 1960 to 1989, that's partly period 8. And that is period 9 as well. And most teachers, I'm guilty of this. We run out of time. I'm like, period 9, read the review book, which is sad, right? Because that's the part of the history that you actually, in some cases, have lived through. But you want to, when you look at the time frame of the question, see if you could put markers on the dates. And what I mean is you don't want to talk about things outside the realm of this question. So you don't want to get into Eisenhower and the Interstate Highway Act. You don't want to get into Truman. You don't want to get into the New Deal in any great detail. You want to stay within the confines of this question. So maybe if you're lucky, the dates will be significant in your mind. So you may, maybe not, I don't know if any of you knew, what is significant about 1960 when we talk about politics? Well, that is the election of John F. Kennedy. And then 1989, we have the election of George Bush, the father, who passed away not too long ago. So it's the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency. So when you're thinking about historical evidence, you want your evidence to be within the realms of from Kennedy to the end of Reagan or the beginning of George Bush. You don't want to cover things. You don't want to talk about the George W. Bush administration or the rise of Barack Obama or the conservatives of the way past. You want to focus it here. And so keep those things in mind. One thing I tell people, and this is kind of, it depends on what you're all about. If this was an LEQ, if this was it, if this was an LEQ, you don't have any documents. Now, the good news is if you didn't know much about this topic, you're going to have two other choices on the exam to select. And if you don't know the LEQ, you will have 3 LEQs. They will be, I believe, all the same historical thinking skills. So there'll be all different causation questions, but one may be the cause of, you know, American expansion in the 1890s. Another one may be a cause of the American independence movement. And then there may be this one. And so what you have to do is, if it was an LEQ, you got to just use that brain and go, okay, what can I do? What can I start to kind of process? And is there a way I can organize my thoughts about this particular topic? And that's really where the key concepts come in. The key concepts can help you with the big ideas. And I want to show you how by giving you this first resource right here. And I believe if you could put this in the chat, that would be fantastic as well. And so the reason why I talk about the key concepts so much is not because I'm a big fan of them. It's just, it helps if you understand the big ideas. And so what I did prior to today's session is found all the different key concepts that relate to this question. And I think I got them all, but I may have missed one or two, but you get the idea. And if you look at these key concepts, and hopefully we get a copy of them in the chat in just a moment. Actually, let me just kind of throw that there. And I don't know if it's in the description yet, but here's the thing if you want to copy paste. And then for all the resources, you know, you don't have to ask for permission. Just go to file and make a copy, and then you have your own. You could type on it. You can do all sorts of fun stuff on it. But basically, if you look at this and just read it, I'm not even talking about opening your book. I'm not talking about getting like a lecture. If you just read through these different things, take a look at this first one right here. In the 1960s, conservatives challenged liberal laws and court decisions and perceived moral and cultural decline, seeking to limit the role of the federal government and enact more assertive foreign policies. We ain't gonna have the time to do this today, but in the resources that are at the bottom, you can kind of click the link here. If you click this right here, we got the key concept graphics for every period, and we have the notes also available. And so you would, if I'm you, is I jot down some ideas. So let's kind of take a look at this first one. In the 1960s, conservatives challenged liberal laws and court decisions and perceived moral and cultural decline, seeking to limit the role of the federal government and enact more assertive foreign policies. Can anybody in the chat give me an example? Oh, excuse me. Thank you. Can anybody give me an example of something from the history that helps us make sense of this, or something, some piece of evidence that would help you defend this statement? And so just take a moment just to kind of think about, like, is there anything that has you remember from their content in your class that would help you understand this or make sense of it? Thank you. Bless you. So you could talk about the, for example, the backlash against the rise of the civil rights movement. You could talk about the backlash against some of the Warren Court decisions, particularly the Miranda decision. You could talk about the fear over the anti-war protest, or the concern that the feminist movement was changing womanhood in a way that conservatives felt was counter to what it should be in terms of their mindset. Limit the role of the federal government. You could talk about the campaign of Barry Goldwater in 1964 and how he was running against this idea of more government programs that Lyndon Johnson was proposing. There's a lot of different things you could do. And if you were to go through each one of these and just spend a couple minutes trying to think of some historical events that help you understand them, what you would get at the end of that, and let me just kind of show you because I did it, this is kind of like all the things without even really diving too deep into it. If this was an LEQ, these are all things that the key concepts make reference to. They don't give you specific historical events, because what the College Board has decided is you and the teacher get to decide what history you learn in class to demonstrate your understanding of reaction against growing federal government. So how would you prove that? Well, you can say, the presidency of Ronald Reagan ran on this idea that government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. You could have talked about perceived failure of social welfare programs. All of these are things that are in the key concepts that don't require you to do a whole bunch of like studying or watching a million review videos or going to a million review sessions, just processing this stuff. And so that is a very important step, is just kind of being familiar with the key concepts. Now, obviously, you're not going to have these with you on the day of the exam. And so my hope is you have enough content knowledge. So if this was a DBQ, which we're going to imagine that it is, and it was back in the day, these are the steps that I really kind of recommend for writing this. You read and analyze the prompt. You do a quick brainstorm. If it is a DBQ, just kind of think, okay, what may I write about? But if it's DBQ, you don't want to spend too much time on that, because the documents will give you kind of a blueprint of what you could talk about. So you're going to analyze the documents, see what they show you, and then you're going to write this essay. And that's all going to be done in 60 minutes, which is easy, right? It's super hard, but still it's doable. So let's kind of take a look at it. So this is kind of like the flow that I have students kind of think things through in my own classes. And you can kind of see, what is the document about? Can you provide a brief summary about the document? Now, keep in mind, this is not what your essay is about. You are not going to write an essay that says document one's about this. He says this, she says that, and then she said this, and then here's a quote from what they said. No, your main job is, how does the document connect to the prompt? How would you use this document to answer the prompt or the question? Can you group or categorize the evidence? And I'm going to show you what this process looks like. Does the document connect to other documents? And we're not going to do outside information or HIPPO or HAPI, whatever you call it, the historical extended analysis today, but we are going to do these first three. So here are the documents, just in case you can't see them. Hold up here. Let me queue them up right here for you. And before I kind of drop the link in the chat, I want to show you something that I always forget to mention it, because it seems not as significant as you might think, but it really is. And that is, the documents are in chronological order. And the reason why that is helpful to know and to remember is that can really do a solid assist for you when writing, because if you start getting all your dates mixed up, oh, I don't remember what happened, who was president in this decade, what did they do? Knowing that the documents are in date order may kind of help you kind of eliminate certain things as happening before the time period or after the time period. So if you take a look, we have 1960, 62. This one is a cover of a magazine from 1970, 71. They're in the date order, which can help in the analysis. And so keep that in mind as well. Now, let's take a look at a document. And here is the first one for this particular DBQ. At the end, I will be giving you a scoring guide. So if you want to kind of practice this process with yourself or your friends, or, you know, have a DBQ party, you'll be able to do it. But if you take a look, I'm gonna kind of walk you through what my mind would do if I'm looking at this document on the DBQ, okay? So the first thing that you do, obviously, is take a look at the document. You know what the question's asking. You know, why did the conservative movement rise up from 1960 to 1989? I noticed right away this document is from 1960, so this is at the beginning of the time frame. It's Barry Goldwater. Chances are, most of you probably don't remember much about him, but maybe you do remember that he ran for president in 1964. Maybe you remember he lost, but you also may remember that he mobilizes a lot of conservative thinkers to this kind of new Republican Party. At this point, he's a Republican senator from the state of Arizona, and he's writing some sort of book about the conscience or article of a conservative. So he is a Republican leader, he is a conservative, and he's writing just as Kennedy and Nixon. We don't have a month, so they're either running for president or the election has taken place. So looking at the sourcing can help you make sense of what you may see in the actual document. Now, if you read the document, and I don't really want to read to you, so I'll just kind of highlight a few things. If I was to read through this thing, what I may notice, and I'll kind of flip it over here to this side, the key things that stand out to me as I'm reading it is he talks about unlimited government, talks about Franklin Roosevelt. His opinion is Franklin Roosevelt's rapid conversion from constitutionalism to the doctrine of unlimited government is an oft-told story. I am here concerned by the unmistakable tendency of the Republican Party to adopt the same course. So he's like, man, the Republicans are doing the same thing that the Democrats are doing. And so he's not a fan of it. The result is that today, neither of our two parties maintains a meaningful commitment to the principle of states' rights. So he's kind of saying that as a conservative, the conscience of a conservative, we must stand by this principle of state rights. Thus, the cornerstone of the republic, our chief bulwark against the encroachment of individual freedom by big government, is fast disappearing under the piling sands of absolutism. And he goes on to say, government engaged in activities which it has not legitimate business. Now, those are my highlights there. But what a lot of students do is they get so lost in the documents, they get so consumed with trying to understand every sentence, every syllable, every word, and you don't need to do that. In fact, there's a good chance, especially if it's a DBQ about an older period in American history where they talk funny and write funny, you may have no idea what every sentence is about, but as long as you get the big idea, you'll be okay. And to answer the question in the chat, you don't need to write the documents in any order. You don't have to start with document 1, document 2, document 3. And I'm going to show you what it will look like if you actually write this essay with 2 of the documents. So you wouldn't write this out in the margins, but if I was summarizing this, you know, this is criticizing growing influence of the federal government under FDR, advocates state rights and accuses the Republican Party of adopting democratic policies, argues for individual freedom over power of big government. Government is doing things they have no power to do, and this leads to excessive spending. That's basically kind of what he's saying if I was to summarize this in a very long way. But your essay is not about the documents. Let me say that again. Your essay is not about the documents. The essay is about what the documents can prove in terms of your argument. So I say to students, it's important to understand what the document's about, but you're not going to write all this in an essay. You'll never get done. Your job is to connect it to the prompt. So if this is his overarching set of ideas, what does this show us? And that's where I start kind of thinking. And I'm going to show you what this is in an essay. But if I had to, if this was the only document that I had, I might say he's responding to increased role of the federal government, a rise of liberalism that occurred during the New Deal, FDR, Fair Deal, Truman, and accepted by Eisenhower, a moderate Republican. Conservative movement grew due to concerns about the growing power of federal government, perceived threats to state powers, and growing federal deficit. So that's kind of really kind of my argument that I'm seeing in here. Once again, I'm not going to write all this, but I wanted you to just see my thinking, what goes through my head as someone who's reading document 1, and I still got 6 more, and I'm supposed to do all that in 15 minutes. What you can prove, as it says in the chat. It's not about what the documents say, it's what do the documents allow you to demonstrate in terms of proof. So if we go to one more document, and I'm going to skip document 2 and 3, because I'm going to show you, you might get a document that you go, what the heck is this? So here is the document 4 that everyone made fun of on Twitter, even though you're not supposed to post on Twitter when the DBQ, this DBQ was done in 2016 or 2015, one of those. 2016, I think, 2015, I don't know. But it's, take a look, letter to Nelson Rockefeller. Okay, I know that name Rockefeller, but I don't know Nelson. I know John, right? Wasn't he the Standard Oil? Republican governor of New York. Okay, cool. I didn't know there was a Rockefeller who was a governor of New York. Maybe that's what you're thinking. 1971. Okay, so it's a governor of New York. He's a Republican. His name is Nelson. He's writing. Okay, that doesn't really help me a whole lot. But if I take a look at this letter, it says, and here's the parts I would highlight, it's talking about they're a law-abiding citizen. They feel discriminated against. They pay taxes and live by the rules, and they get very little from taxes. This is their view. I also like the fact that they say, sorry, this letter is not typed. My typewriter was stolen. And have you all ever had your typewriter stolen? If you do, leave a comment in the chat. Some of you are like, what is a typewriter? Google it. So if I'm describing this document, it's a letter from a citizen to the governor of New York, feels the system is stacked against those who do everything right in society. It's protecting criminals and drug addicts. The government's social welfare programs benefit criminals and welfare cheats rather than law-abiding citizens. That's kind of what I get from this document. If I was telling my friend at the bus, hey, I read this document, here's what it's about, I might say something like this. If I was writing an essay, though, here's what I would do. This connects to the prompt because it shows the conservative movement grew due to perceived moral decay of American society. They're saying there's all this crime and there's drugs and there's a feeling that the social welfare programs are failing. And you see that in this document. So what do you do after you've done this same process with 7 documents? And that's where it gets a little tricky. If I have document 1 and document 4, here's what I think document 4 is saying, here's what I think document 1 is saying, I might be able to group them together. That means when I write my actual essay, I'm going to talk about both these documents in the same body paragraph. And so both document 1 and 4 reflect rising concerns over increased power of the federal government and concerns government programs are costly and do not work. Right? They're both kind of hinting at that or in fact saying it. And so when you're trying to do this on the exam, when it's game time and you're ready to show off your 6 skills like Abraham Lincoln is right here, and check out my YouTube channel, Jocz Productions, got resources for you. You may write a thesis, but it should not look like this. Here is my trash thesis number 1. If you were to write a new conservatism rose to prominence in the US between 1960 and 1989, you're getting nothing. All you're doing is repeating the prompt. You're rewording the prompt. They know that. They told you to explain why. But so many students will just kind of reword it and think, sweet, score. No, not going to work. Another trash thesis that is not going to work. There were many reasons for the rise of a new conservative movement in the US between the years 1960 to 1989. Yeah, there were, but what were they? Please tell us so that you can get college credit. You can't just say there were reasons. You got to actually give them. Don't just reword the prompt. Don't just recycle stuff. And that's what I'm saying. So the comment, yeah, I would not make a thesis until you've looked at all 7 documents. But due to time, I'm just going to say we looked at all 7, and I'm going to give you all 7. But imagine we only had time to use 2, what this essay may look like. So one thing that I oftentimes tell my students, especially if you're trying to get the complexity point, which we'll talk about that in some of our other sessions, is to recognize the counter argument. You're not required to recognize the counter argument. If you are a struggling writer, you may not know how to do this. And between now and the day of the AP exam, it may not be enough time to learn how to do this really well. But if you know how to do it, it's worth trying. So for example, you might say something like, although federal programs such as Social Security and Medicare remain popular with many Americans, so it's saying, yes, there's a new conservative movement, but that doesn't mean all the liberal programs are hated. In fact, they're still around. They're still popular amongst many Americans. So it's saying, yes, a new movement's going to arise, but doesn't mean like we're going back to the days of laissez-faire. And recognizing the counter argument, I think, is very important, especially for those of you aiming for a 4 or 5 on your exam. And then you might launch into something like this. A new conservatism rose to prominence during the period 1960 to 1989 due to rising concerns that many government programs were costly and ineffective, the federal government was becoming too powerful, and growing concerns over high taxes. And so that is a good thesis. It has an argument. It has a line of reasoning. Here is reason 1. Many government programs were costly and ineffective. The government was becoming too powerful. This is kind of what Barry Goldwater was talking about in document 1. Their argument is the government doesn't have the right to do what it's doing with some of these programs. And remember, that's a debate as old as Hamilton and Jefferson. Oh, can we create a bank? Yes, no. So people have always disagreed about these issues. It's just the issues are changing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then concerns over taxes. Now, this is not a perfect thesis. This is not the only thesis. In fact, there's a weird saying, which I was preparing this and I'm like, there's a saying that says there's more than one way to skin a cat, which is like the most awful thing to way of saying, like, there's more than one way to accomplish the goal. So there's more than one way to skin a cat. I don't even know, I just Googled this. I don't even know if this is true. I just put this in here just because I was fascinated by this saying, but apparently it started in 1832, but we ain't got time to keep doing that. These are all thesis statements, some of them complex, some of them simple, that would receive a point on this exam. And in the Google Slides, you can kind of see there's different approaches. You don't have to say that one reason was the fear that America was losing its traditional moral values. That doesn't need to be one of your line of reasons, even if some of the documents allude to it. But if enough of the documents are saying something, you want to include it because you're trying to get the points on the exam. And so some people use a formula. I'm going to skip this right now just because of time. But, if you're into the formulas, they tend to confuse me. So your counter argument, and then your thesis. But that's kind of what it looks like. I really, at this point, wouldn't worry about it if you haven't been practicing this in class with your history teacher, English teacher, or just when you write your novels on the weekend. But here's our thesis, and here's what it may look like if it was turned into a body paragraph. And so take a look. We got our thesis. Although federal programs such as Social Security and Medicare remain popular with many Americans, a new conservatism rose to prominence during the 1960s and 1989 due to rising concerns that many government programs were costly and ineffective. The federal government was becoming too powerful, and growing concerns over high taxes. So there's our thesis. And imagine there's some contextualization just before that. We're not going to focus on contextualization today. And I'm going to answer the question about using documents, how many, in just a moment. Let me just kind of show you a sample paragraph. So let's just say this DBQ, we were only going to use documents 1 and 3. I just want to show you how you may incorporate them. This is not the only way to do it, but this is one way you may have used document 1 and document 4. One factor, so now you're starting to defend your thesis, that caused a rise in the conservative movement were growing concerns about government spending, questions about the legitimacy of the federal government's involvement in various aspects of American life, and whether or not such government programs were effective. So that's kind of like building on the thesis statement. Document 1, and I know some teachers say, don't say document 1, say Barry Goldwater's speech or Barry Goldwater's book. It doesn't matter. If you say document 1, you'll get a point if you do it well. If you call it by name, you'll get a point if you do it well. You ain't got time to worry about style at this point, and you don't get graded for style here. So reveals concern among some Republicans that the programs begun under Roosevelt administration were accepted by both Democrats and Republicans. So that's one thing he said, is that the Republican Party has lost his way. Barry Goldwater, a Republican senator, openly questioned whether or not the federal government even had the authority under the Constitution to expand in the matter that it had by 1960. So that is kind of a document analysis. You may go on to bring in some outside information. While the Supreme Court did declare some New Deal programs unconstitutional in the 1930s, and this is a sample from a student that I've taught that kind of brought this in. And, you know, this is outside the boundaries of the question. Remember, the question is 1960 to 1989, but they don't go into great detail. They don't then go, and the AAA and the NRA was ruled unconstitutional. Then Franklin Roosevelt tried the court packing plan. They're not doing that. They're just making a reference showing that they understand that these battles have happened before and they're going on. Others continue to expand. And later on, under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, government spending and oversight would dramatically increase and lead to renewed conservative opposition. So they're defending, because the government has been growing since Roosevelt, increased under Lyndon Johnson, conservatives are pushing back against that. Further evidence of these conservative arguments against new liberal programs and policies can be seen in document 4. In the letter to Nelson Rockefeller, an American citizen states that they feel like their tax dollars are being wasted on ineffective government programs that benefit dope addicts and welfare cheats over law-abiding citizens. This document, written in the early 70s, is well after the liberal reforms of the Great Society had taken effect and reflects the belief of some Americans that America's social safety net was failing and money was being wasted. And so definitely, if you can, cite it by the author's last name as is being discussed in the chat. But if you are struggling, it's perfectly fine if it helps you to just say document 1. But yeah, the better way would be Senator Goldwater and go on and say what he says. So this is just an example of how you may use this. This is how you may kind of analyze the documents to defend your thesis, analyze a document to defend your thesis, bring in outside information. And in this particular body paragraph, you're doing 2 different things with the outside information and the document analysis, 2 parts of the rubric you're handling. And that's really what you want to try to do. So when you're grouping the documents, you don't write your essay, document 1 says this, document 2 says this, document 3 says this. You want to think, are there things that they're saying that are similar so that you can kind of use them in conjunction with one another? So if you were to keep doing this, and let me kind of in the chat put this particular essay. Here is the scoring guide, and this scoring guide is just a mix of notes kind of breaking down what you need to do. You will see on the scoring guide possible thesis arguments that you could do, samples. If we're looking at arguments or organization, we didn't look at document 3 or 6, but they deal with foreign policy defeats and criticisms about America's foreign policy, this feeling that America was not on top of its game as it once was. Documents 5 and 7 kind of are talking about American values, and these are some of the areas where conservatives tended to criticize those other movements. You can kind of really write a solid essay using these different documents. And I've given you some examples of ways that you can do this on this essay if you were going to write it to the bitter end. But this is kind of the way you want to do your document analysis. So let me go ahead and take a look at the chat to see what questions we might have. Can you use one source for 2 documents? When you say one source, I'm a little confused by what you mean. Like saying, if you could clarify, that would be good. I think the important thing to take away here is, okay, I'm looking at some of the other comments. You know, the thing you need to keep in mind, you do not need to use all of the documents. You get a point for using up to 6 of them to advance your thesis. But you should, for those of you going for the higher score, try to use 7 in the event that you mess one up. However, and I don't want to like end it on a controversial strategy, but many teachers argue that if you know that you're going to struggle on the DBQ, you may want to focus on just 4 documents and write a really good essay, hipping those 4, using those 4 to advance your thesis, because it is very hard, very difficult to actually use 6 of them to advance your thesis in 60 minutes. So a lot of students and a lot of teachers I know recommend using 4 documents and focusing and just not trying for that second document point. And we could definitely go over that in more detail if you have questions, but I don't want to contradict what you've been taught in your classes. If you are going for the really high score, you're gonna need to use 6 of the documents for that. All right, what are the main points we need to know for this time period? Unit 9. So there is no way we're going to get into everything you need to know for the units, but as I said on the link, there is a link with a bunch of APUSH resources where I break down the things that you should know, the items that are essential. And so we have that for all the different units that are tested by the College Board. Remember, Unit 9, Period 9 is the smallest, along with Period 1, in terms of the amount it will be on the exam, around 5% or less. In our next session, which will be tomorrow at 4 p.m. West Coast time, East Coast time, obviously 3 hours ahead, and all you other folks, check your time zone. But we will be covering Unit 8, which is one of my favorites. But we're going to be taking a look at the 1950s and really how history is way more complex than is typically portrayed. We're going to be looking at what do you do when different sources contradict one another? And what do you do if you're writing a DBQ and your thesis is, yes, there was change, but then there's a document that says, no, there wasn't change, or vice versa. And so we're going to be taking a look at how to develop a complex thesis and looking at historical documents while also reviewing the 1950s.
Daniel?
Yes.
We have a question that popped up a while ago that said, if you are doing a causation questions and you write about the effects throughout the paper, would the effects be considered complexity or not?
They can be. And I don't mean to be like elusive with my answer. It's just, it's really, the complexity point is kind of like one of those things where you know it when you see it. It's hard to really say, yeah, if you do that, you're going to get it. But it sounds like if you do that well, that you can kind of score that complexity point, because there's, as the rubric states, there's a lot of different things you can do. Kind of come back to this rubric here, wherever it may be. So it sounds like that would be one way to accomplish that goal. But once again, it really depends on how it's accomplished, because you're gonna need to really meet the requirements set for that particular question by the College Board. All right, well, tomorrow, my good friends, we will be going into the 1950s, a topic that I hope that is of interest and of use to you all. And like I said, the skill we'll be looking at is complex understanding as well as using documents. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been a pleasure, and catch you next time.